Night draped itself over a forgotten alley in the older part of Huntsville, Alabama. The damp air carried the smell of rust and wet concrete, clinging to brick walls that had seen better decades. Kneeling under the flicker of a dying streetlight was Ellis Hawthorne, a grizzled Vietnam veteran whose tattered camouflage jacket barely shielded him from the creeping chill. His rough hands pressed against the cracked asphalt as if anchoring him to the only reality he could still trust. In front of him, muscles coiled but unmoving, stood Orion, a German Shepherd K9 whose dark eyes stayed fixed on Ellis with an intelligence that unsettled even his handler. A few feet behind Orion, Officer Nolan Graves hovered with a hand near his holster, torn between the procedure drilled into him at the academy and the raw, silent plea he saw in the old man's sunken eyes. But Orion didn't bark. He didn't bare his teeth. He simply waited, chest rising and falling, as if guarding something fragile no one else could see. Ellis's breath shuddered out of him in ragged bursts. Buried under layers of regret, he felt old memories clawing back, visions of burning jungles, the panicked gasps of brothers in arms, and a boy's laughter that never reached adulthood. His heartbeat drummed painfully in his ears, while Orion's calm stare cut through the fog of distant gunfire and broken promises. For the first time in years, the weight on his shoulders shifted, just enough for the air to taste less bitter. Officer Graves' voice cracked through the static of his radio. "Dispatch, suspect is unarmed, K9 is not engaging. Requesting supervisor on site." His tone betrayed the confusion on his face. He'd seen Orion take down armed fugitives twice his size without hesitation. Yet here, facing an unarmed, trembling veteran, the dog refused to move. Graves lowered his weapon hand, as if afraid a single wrong motion might break the spell that tethered Ellis to this alley, and to sanity. A sudden gust sent an empty beer can clattering along the curb, but Orion didn't flinch. Instead, he lowered his head, taking slow, deliberate steps toward Ellis. The veteran's cracked lips parted, a ghost of a whisper escaping him. Maybe an apology, maybe a forgotten prayer. When Orion's cold nose touched Ellis's dirt-caked hand, a tremor rippled through the man's bones, waking something he'd buried in foreign soil decades ago. Graves edged closer, voice softer than before. "Mr. Hawthorne, can you hear me? He's here to help you." But Ellis barely heard him. All he knew was the warm breath of a loyal creature refusing to see him as broken. As the last flicker of the streetlight died, man and dog stayed locked in a wordless promise, one that would lead them both down a path neither was ready to face. The steady pulse of police radios hummed through the alley as backup arrived, red and blue lights dancing across damp walls. Officer Nolan Graves stood protectively near Ellis Hawthorne, who sat now on the cold curb, Orion pressed firmly against his side like a silent guardian. Graves kept glancing at the veteran, noting how Ellis's shoulders trembled each time an officer barked orders into the radio. In that fragile moment, Graves realized Ellis wasn't a threat. He was a man cornered by memories darker than any back alley. Captain Rosalind Keats stepped through the gathered officers, her sharp eyes scanning the scene before resting on Graves and the kneeling K9. She was the kind of leader who carried command in her very breath, her coat buttoned tight despite the mild night air. "Graves," she said curtly. "Report." Her tone left no room for excuses or confusion, yet softened when her eyes flicked to the trembling veteran clinging to the dog. "Captain Keats, this is Ellis Hawthorne, Vietnam vet. He's been off the radar for a while. Orion here." Graves gestured to the dog still glued to Ellis's side. "Refused to attack. He sensed something I can't explain. I think we need medical, not handcuffs." His voice caught slightly at the end, afraid that regulations would crush the fragile trust between man and animal he'd just witnessed. Keats studied Ellis with a practiced calm. She had seen violent criminals break in her interrogation room, but the haunted look in Ellis's eyes was different. A battlefield frozen behind pupils clouded by time and grief. She knelt down, ignoring the grime that soaked her uniform's knee. "Mr. Hawthorne, can you stand up for me?" Her voice was firm but motherly, reaching for the soldier beneath the wreckage. Ellis blinked slowly, Orion's fur gripped in his weathered hand. For a breathless second, the alley disappeared. In its place, he saw a young woman in uniform, Margot, his daughter, wearing her high school ROTC jacket, begging him to stay sober long enough to see her graduate. That memory cracked him open more than any gunfire ever had. He swallowed back the ache and nodded, pushing himself up with Keats's steady grip on his elbow. Behind them, Graves ordered the other officers to stand down, waving away the paramedics who hovered with stretchers and cuffs alike. In his gut, Graves knew tonight wasn't about arrests. It was about a man who needed someone to fight beside him, someone like Orion, someone like a rookie cop who still believed not all battles ended on the battlefield. As they guided Ellis toward the cruiser, Graves silently vowed not to let the department bury this story under paperwork and closed-case files. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed above Ellis Hawthorne as he sat slumped in a cracked plastic chair at Huntsville General Hospital. Orion lay at his feet, chin resting on Ellis's worn boot, eyes flicking up at every passing nurse. Beside them, Officer Nolan Graves flipped through the same intake form for the third time, his fingers drumming nervously on his clipboard. The sterile air smelled faintly of antiseptic and stale coffee, a world apart from the alley where a dog had refused to see a broken man as dangerous. Captain Rosalind Keats appeared down the hallway, her steps deliberate and her eyes locked on Graves. She had stayed behind to brief the paramedics and push through the paperwork that would make sure Ellis wasn't booked as a vagrant but treated as a veteran in crisis. She paused beside the two, her gaze softening at the sight of Orion curled like a shield at Ellis's feet. "Any word?" she asked, her tone quieter than the night before. Graves shook his head, glancing at Ellis, who seemed somewhere far away. "Dr. Mercer's on his way, VA specialist. He's dealt with veterans like him before, night terrors, disassociation. But I don't know if Ellis will even talk." Graves lowered his voice, mindful not to snap Ellis's fragile calm. "Orion's the only thing anchoring him right now." Keats crouched to Orion's level, scratching behind his ears, feeling the dog's steady warmth against her palm. "Then we keep Orion close," she murmured, more to herself than to Graves. She stood, eyes flicking between Ellis and the automatic doors that squeaked open every few minutes, as if each newcomer might threaten the fragile truce holding this man together. A new figure entered then. Dr. Calvin Mercer, a tall man with tired kindness in his eyes and a coffee stain on his sweater vest. He nodded politely to Keats and Graves before kneeling directly in front of Ellis. "Mr. Hawthorne," he said gently, voice warm as a blanket in winter. "I'm Dr. Mercer. I served 2 Desert Storm. May I sit with you?" He didn't push a clipboard or speak in clinical jargon. Instead, he gestured to Orion. "He's your partner tonight, huh?" For the first time in hours, Ellis lifted his head and met Mercer's eyes, a flicker of recognition crossing his lined face. He opened his mouth, throat dry, and rasped. He stayed, just 2 words, but they cracked the silence like thunder. Orion's ears perked at his voice, tail thumping once, an unspoken promise that he would stay as long as needed. Graves and Keats exchanged a look that needed no words. This was the first step. Outside the hospital windows, dawn threatened the horizon. But inside that sterile room, a wounded soldier and a loyal dog had begun to stitch together a piece of trust no uniform could command. Graves quietly texted an update to the precinct. "Ellis Hawthorne is talking, and Orion is staying." Morning sunlight pushed through the thin hospital blinds, casting pale stripes across Ellis Hawthorne's tired face. He sat propped on a stiff bed, and 4 taped to his arm, yet his eyes stayed locked on the only presence that seemed to steady him, Orion, curled dutifully on the floor, nose tucked under his tail. Ellis's fingers brushed the dogs for every few seconds, grounding himself in a world that, without Orion, felt too bright and too loud. Dr. Calvin Mercer stood near the window, jotting notes in a worn leather notebook. Occasionally, he asked gentle questions, small ones about food, sleep, the nightmares, but Ellis spoke little, offering only grunts or weary nods. Outside the room, Officer Nolan Graves leaned against the wall, sipping bad coffee, refusing to leave until he knew Ellis wouldn't vanish into some bureaucratic void labeled unfit or unclaimed. The door clicked open, and a figure Ellis hadn't seen in nearly a decade stepped in. Margot Hawthorne, her name a bruise on his memory, froze the moment her eyes landed on him. She wore a crisp blazer, her dark hair pinned back the way she'd worn it in law school, but her trembling hands betrayed her polished front. Graves looked up sharply, sensing the shift in air. He straightened and murmured to Mercer, "She came." Margot cleared her throat, trying and failing to control the quake in her voice. "Dad." Just one syllable, but Ellis flinched as if she'd struck him. Orion's ears twitched at the tension, rising slightly but staying beside Ellis's leg. Dr. Mercer offered Margot a gentle nod, stepping back to give her room, though he stayed close enough to step in if words turned sharp. Ellis forced himself to look at her, his throat working around old apologies that stuck like thorns. "Margot." The word cracked, dry as desert wind. In her eyes, he saw every disappointment, every birthday missed, every promise broken by a bottle or a memory too heavy to drown. He wanted to say he was sorry, but the shame in her eyes made him feel 12 years old again, helpless, furious, alone. Margot crossed her arms, voice low but fierce. "The police called me, said you were found half dead in an alley with a K9 protecting you like you were someone worth saving." She paused, eyes brimming but unyielding. "Are you dead? Are you worth saving this time?" Ellis couldn't answer, but Orion nudged his knee, as if to remind him. Someone here already believed he was. Outside the hospital door, Graves exhaled slowly, knowing this was the battle no badge could fight for Ellis. Only family, if there was any left to claim him. The hush of the hospital room wrapped around Margot Hawthorne like a vice. She sat stiffly in the corner chair, arms crossed so tightly her knuckles whitened. Across from her, Ellis Hawthorne stared at the floor, the foreline tugging slightly whenever he shifted. Between them, Orion lay in a protective sprawl, his big head resting on Ellis's boot, as if guarding the fragile bridge holding father and daughter in the same room for the first time in years. Officer Nolan Graves watched from the doorway, pretending to scroll his phone while tracking every flicker of tension inside. He had fought drug dealers in back alleys and angry drunks in broken-down bars, but nothing unnerved him like the raw, silent war that raged between a daughter who had buried her father in her mind and a father who had abandoned himself long before she did. Ellis cleared his throat, voice rough as gravel. "Margot, I didn't want you to see me like this." His eyes stayed down, fixed on the paw Orion pressed gently to his knee. The dog's steady breathing seemed to remind him to keep talking, even as shame tightened every word. "You shouldn't have come." Margot's laugh was short, bitter. "Don't flatter yourself. Graves called me because they needed next of kin. If I hadn't answered, you'd be in a drunk tank or a hospital psych ward alone." She leaned forward, her voice trembling with fury she'd rehearsed countless nights. "Do you know what it cost me to walk back through that door, Dad? Do you?" The question pierced deeper than any battlefield wound Ellis had ever carried. He opened his mouth to answer, but only a strangled breath came out. Dr. Calvin Mercer, who had returned quietly with a cup of bad hospital coffee, stepped in before the silence broke them apart completely. "Margot, maybe we let him rest. This anger, it's real, but it's a weight both of you keep dragging behind you. Let's not drown him tonight." Margot wiped at a tear she refused to acknowledge. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor like an accusation. "Fine, rest. Drink your hospital soup. Pretend a dog fixes everything. But don't expect me to sit here pretending you were ever a father worth remembering." She shot a last glance at Graves, half apology, half resentment, then stormed out into the hallway. Ellis slumped back against the pillows, breath ragged, Orion shifting closer to press his warmth against the old man's side. In that quiet aftermath, Graves stepped inside, placing a steady hand on Ellis's shoulder. He whispered, "Don't give up now." She came. "That means something." Ellis shut his eyes, clinging to the only loyal heartbeat left beside him. Long after Margot Hawthorne's footsteps vanished down the sterile hallway, the hospital room settled into a heavy hush. Ellis Hawthorne lay awake, though his eyes were closed, every muscle stiff beneath the thin blanket. Orion's steady breath against his leg was the only tether keeping him from slipping too far into the darker corners of his mind, where old firefights and broken promises waited like ghosts. Officer Nolan Graves sat slumped in a hard chair by the window, reading the same line of his report for the 10th time. He glanced at Ellis, noting how his chest rose and fell with a forced rhythm, each inhale a battle one. Quietly, Graves rose and knelt by Orion, scratching behind the dog's ears. "You're a miracle, buddy. You know that?" he whispered. Orion flicked his tail but didn't move, eyes locked on Ellis, guardian and witness in one. A soft knock broke the room's stillness. Dr. Calvin Mercer stepped in, a file tucked under his arm and a look that balanced caution with hope. He nodded at Graves before focusing on Ellis. "I got your old VA records, Ellis, and your discharge papers. Some letters too. Letters you never opened." He set the folder gently on the bedside table. The rustle of old envelopes seemed louder than the beeping heart monitor. Ellis didn't open his eyes, but his voice was clearer than before. Each word scraped raw. "No more letters, document. Last ones I opened ruined a boy's birthday and ended a marriage in the same month." His hand drifted to Orion's head, fingertips brushing soft fur, as if to steady his pulse. "I buried everything for a reason." Mercer perched on the edge of the bed, ignoring hospital policy. "You buried it so deep it buried you too. And Margot, she's proof some wounds pass on if we don't clean them out." He kept his tone gentle, but his eyes stayed locked on Ellis's. "If you won't read them for you, read them for her. Or for him." He nodded at Orion. "He didn't give up on you in that alley, Ellis. Don't give up on you now." Ellis finally cracked open weary eyes, staring at the folder like it might bite him. His fingertips hovered over the faded paper edges, trembling. Orion pressed his head harder against Ellis's knee, grounding him to the here and now. Ellis drew a shaky breath. "One letter," he murmured. "Just one? For tonight." Graves and Mercer exchanged a quiet glance, a shared understanding that sometimes redemption didn't roar. It began with a single, fearful word whispered under a hospital's flickering lights. Ellis Hawthorne held the first letter between trembling fingers, its envelope yellowed and brittle at the edges. The fluorescent hospital light made the faded ink look ghostly, each word a bruise he'd avoided for years. Beside him on the bed, Orion rested his chin on Ellis's thigh, eyes flicking up every time Ellis's hands shook too hard to keep reading. Across the room, Officer Nolan Graves leaned against the wall, arms crossed but his eyes gentle, guarding this fragile reckoning. Dr. Calvin Mercer sat close, a quiet sentinel to Ellis's confession by paper. "Take your time," he said softly, though the tension in his own shoulders betrayed how badly he wanted Ellis to finish. The clock on the wall ticked off the seconds like a distant drumbeat. Outside the door, nurses passed by without slowing. Inside, the past was unfolding one trembling breath at a time. Ellis's cracked voice broke the silence. "Dear Dad, Mom says you're still overseas, but I know you're just busy. It's okay. I got the baseball glove. I practiced every day. Maybe when you're home, you'll teach me to pitch like you promised." His throat clenched, words crumbling to a whisper. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the boy's grin danced in his mind anyway. Tommy Hawthorne, forever 8 years old, forever waiting. Orion whined softly, pressing his muzzle closer, as if urging Ellis to breathe. Graves swallowed hard, blinking back the sting in his own eyes. He'd seen hardened criminals confess murders with less pain than this old soldier reading a child's plea for a father's promise kept. Mercer shifted closer, his hand resting gently on Ellis's forearm, a silent reminder he wasn't alone with this shame anymore. Ellis dropped the letter onto the blanket, hands covering his face. The sob tore out of him, ragged and too big for the hospital room to hold. Orion pawed at him, climbing partly into his lap, heavy and warm, the anchor Ellis had needed in every dark year since he'd come home. Between muffled cries, Ellis rasped, "I failed him. I failed her. I failed everyone who ever." "Stop," Graves' voice cut through the tremor in Ellis's chest. He stepped forward, kneeling beside Orion. "You can't change that boy's birthday, Ellis. But you're here now. You have a daughter outside who still came back to see you. And you have him." He scratched behind Orion's ears, the dog leaning into the touch. "Don't waste the second chance he gave you in that alley." Ellis lowered his hands, eyes raw and red but clearer than before. He touched the letter again, fingers steady this time. "One more," he whispered hoarsely. "One more letter. For Tommy. For Margot. For me." Outside, the first sunlight crawled over the parking lot asphalt, promising a day he'd almost never live to see. The letter lay open on Ellis Hawthorne's lap, its edges curling slightly under his trembling fingers. The words danced and blurred, but he forced himself to read every line. Each sentence was a needle threading memories he'd locked away. Orion, faithful as ever, shifted his weight closer, resting a warm paw atop Ellis's foot as if pinning him to the present when the past threatened to swallow him whole. Officer Nolan Graves watched from the corner, arms folded tight over his chest. He'd come here to guard a fragile old man from himself, but now he realized Ellis wasn't the only one being patched back together. Watching a father fight his own regrets did something to Graves too. Reminded him that some rescues weren't written in police reports but carved deep in second chances. The hospital door creaked open. Margot Hawthorne stepped back into the room, uncertainty flickering across her tired face. She had left hours ago swearing she wouldn't return. Yet here she was, clutching a paper coffee cup so tight her knuckles shone white. Her eyes fell first on her father, then on Orion, then on the opened letters scattered on the blanket like small paper wounds. "You're reading them," she said, voice brittle. Ellis lifted his gaze to meet hers. His face was pale, eyes red, but in them burned a resolve that had been missing for decades. "I should have read them when they arrived, Margot. Maybe I'd have been less of a ghost in your life." His words cracked but didn't break. Orion's tail thumped once, sensing the weight shifting in the room. Margot set her coffee on the window ledge and stepped closer, drawn in despite every wall she'd built to protect herself. "I spent years hating you," she whispered. "Mom did too, but I hated you harder because I still hoped you'd show up someday, sober and sane, ready to be my dad." Her voice caught, tears she'd sworn not to shed shining at the corners of her eyes. Ellis opened his arms, hesitating as if terrified she might flinch. Instead, Margot sank into him, the hug awkward at first but tightening as decades of silence cracked open. Orion nudged closer, pressing against both of them, tail wagging gently. Graves turned away, pretending to check a message on his phone, but a quiet smile tugged at his lips. In that small, sterile room, father and daughter rediscovered something that war, liquor, and loneliness had almost stolen for good: the fragile, stubborn spark of forgiveness. Outside the window, sunlight spread over the city, proof that some broken doors, if left ajar, can still swing wide open again. For the first time in years, Ellis Hawthorne stood under open sky without feeling like a stranger to it. He leaned heavily on a cane Graves had brought him, his hospital wristband still dangling loose around his thin wrist. Orion padded faithfully at his side, nose brushing Ellis's hand every few steps, guiding him through the rehab garden behind the hospital. Spring sunlight poured over them. Gentle warmth Ellis could feel sinking into bones starved of peace. Beside him, Officer Nolan Graves walked at an easy pace, careful not to rush the older man. He had traded his uniform for a simple hoodie and jeans. Today, he wasn't a cop guarding a patient. He was a friend watching a man learn how to stand in his own life again. He glanced at Orion and chuckled. "You know, Ellis, you ever think maybe Orion didn't find you that night? Maybe you found him." Ellis paused near a bench under a budding dogwood tree. He lowered himself slowly, Orion settling right at his feet. "Maybe," Ellis rasped, his voice still hoarse but steadier. "All my life, I thought I was beyond saving. But that night," he reached down, scratching behind Orion's ear. "This dog looked at me like I was worth staying for. Nobody's done that in a long time. A faint sound of footsteps drew their attention. Margot Hawthorne appeared at the garden gate, a folder tucked under her arm. Her posture was straighter today, her eyes clear, her expression softer than the storm that had stormed out of that hospital room days before. She raised a hand in greeting, and Graves gave her a nod before slipping away to give father and daughter room. Margot sat beside Ellis on the bench, close but not yet leaning in. She set the folder on his knee, opening it gently. Inside were rehab forms, housing assistance papers, and a volunteer application for Ellis to help train therapy dogs for other struggling veterans. "I talked to Dr. Mercer," she said, her voice calm, adult, yet with a tremor that made her sound like the daughter Ellis remembered tucking in at night. "If you're serious about staying sober and staying with us, there's a place in Huntsville that works with dogs like Orion. And with men like you." Ellis's eyes brimmed but didn't spill over. He laid a hand over hers, rough and scarred, but steady. Orion nosed at the folder, as if approving this plan for a new chapter. Ellis exhaled, a shaky laugh escaping him. "I'm serious, kiddo. I don't know how to do it alone. But maybe I don't have to." Margot leaned her head on his shoulder, her forgiveness still fragile but real. And Orion, tail sweeping the garden path, rested his head across Ellis's boots. Faithful proof that sometimes redemption arrives on four paws when you least expect it. Weeks passed, and for the first time in years, Ellis Hawthorne woke each morning to the sound of something other than silence or regret. His small room at the Veterans Recovery Center smelled faintly of strong coffee and clean laundry. Simple things, but proof he was still here, still trying. By his bedside, as always, Orion lay curled on the floor, eyes half open, always watching, as if the dog feared Ellis might slip away again if left alone too long. Ellis swung his legs over the side of the bed, his knees protesting the motion, but he didn't curse them like he used to. Pain meant he was alive, and living meant he had somewhere to be. He pulled on his battered jacket, clean now, the patches mended properly by a kind volunteer, and reached for Orion's leash. "Ready to go to work, soldier?" he asked, his voice steady, even playful. Orion's ears perked and his tail wagged. Answer enough. Outside, spring had fully taken hold of Huntsville. Cherry blossoms dusted the sidewalks around the center's training yard where Ellis now spent his mornings helping other vets learn to trust again. One dog, one handshake, one careful conversation at a time. Officer Nolan Graves dropped by often, pretending he just needed to check paperwork but staying to toss a ball for Orion and remind Ellis how far he'd come since that cold night in the alley. Margot Hawthorne arrived every Saturday, bringing takeout and fresh questions about his past. Questions she once swore she'd never care to ask. They sat on a picnic bench under an old oak, Orion dozing at their feet, while father and daughter stitched small truths and hard apologies into something that looked more and more like family. She didn't call him Dad every time, but sometimes she did, and that was enough to keep Ellis trying. One afternoon, Ellis paused during a training session to watch a young veteran, barely older than Tommy would have been, crouch beside a nervous Labrador, whispering to the dog like Ellis had once whispered to Orion. He felt a soft ache where guilt used to live, but it didn't crush him anymore. He knew Tommy's memory didn't have to be just a wound. It could be a reason to stand tall, to help another broken boy find steadiness where he himself once lost it. As the sun dipped low, Ellis sat with Orion by his side, eyes closed, face tilted to catch the last warm rays. He thought of war, of letters unopened, of Margot's hesitant smile and Graves' quiet loyalty. He thought of a dog who had chosen not to attack but to stand guard over a man everyone else had written off. And for the first time, Ellis Hawthorne let himself believe that sometimes, even the most wounded heart can learn to belong again, one faithful paw print at a time.